this book about anxiety long before the pandemic, about a year or so in terms of the planning stages. And, and then I've started writing it in earnest during the pandemic. No one on the planet didn't now know anxiety up close and personal. And what was interesting to me is I felt that despite that, and maybe because of it, the message of the book was as important as ever. And it sort of deepened what I was trying to say. The core message of the book is that we mental health professionals have unintentionally given people some damaging information when it comes to anxiety. And we've essentially spread these two fallacies about anxiety. First, it's that anxiety is always, every experience of it, a debilitating experience. It's dangerous. And it's even something we should think of as a disease, like COVID, like cancer. And so when we think of our experiences of anxiety as a disease, that means that the solution would be to prevent it and eradicate it and destroy it at all costs, like we do any disease. The problem with that when it comes to anxiety is that that is literally a recipe for making anxiety worse. The more we avoid, there's a paradox with anxiety. The more we avoid, the more we suppress, the more it tends to spiral out of control. And so we actually not only have now more intense anxiety because we're avoiding it, but we lose the opportunity to actually look at anxiety and its potentially helpful parts. Because anxiety is something, as an emotion that we've evolved to have, that by anchoring us into the future tense, this ability to actually think into the future and to plan and to dream and imagine and to hope, it actually not only protects us, we can think about anxiety as protecting us, but it actually also makes us more persistent, more innovative, more creative, and more socially connected. So this story that we have all come to believe about anxiety is actually really starting to get in the way, especially during a time like the pandemic when we can't escape anxiety. And during the pandemic, if we expected that we'd have no anxiety, then that would be a constant failure on our part, right? And that's the second sort of false idea that we've unintentionally spread, we mental health professionals, that any experience of anxiety is a malfunction and a failure. So what do? We start to try to fix it all the time. We start to, again, try to avoid it and suppress it. And we lose those opportunities to see how it can actually be a strength and a source of resilience. The pandemic revealed that as well. Anxiety can be very intense, very extreme even, but that doesn't mean that it's an anxiety disorder. So anxiety is an emotion that doesn't need fixing. It's not broken. It's doing its work for us. A healthy mindset about anxiety is one in which we look at it very differently than we're used to looking at it. We're looking at anxiety as a problem to solve. But anxiety is a feature of being human. And when you look at the difference between anxiety and fear, it starts to help us understand that. So fear is the present certainty. We're absolutely certain that right now we're in danger. But anxiety is not that. Anxiety is apprehension about the uncertain future. That is, we know that there's something coming around the bend. It could be bad, but it could also be good. So what anxiety helps us do is prepare to make those good things happen. A healthy mindset about anxiety can acknowledge that there is real advantage to this experience of anxiety, and it's not the same as an anxiety disorder every single time. A second healthy mindset about anxiety involves this perspective about anxiety that it's information. It's telling us that, there's something happening in the future and we really care enough to make it happen. We're in it to win it when we're anxious. And so the smoke alarm analogy is helpful because if you're in a house and the smoke alarm goes off, you wouldn't just ignore it and put on earplugs and just sort of, or move into another area of the house where you can't hear it. You'd at the very least go and check that the batteries were in it. Even more intelligently, you might actually decide to look around and see if there really was a fire going on. So when we start to think of anxiety not as this dangerous thing, but as a helpful thing, that changes everything about how we then, when we face anxious moments, whether they're controllable or uncontrollable, it helps us cope with that at our best. And a third aspect about having a healthy mindset about anxiety is that we think of it as not something that overwhelms us when we face the uncertain world around us, but rather that helps us navigate uncertainty. Because anxiety is an emotion that actually evolved to translate and to navigate the uncertain world. And of course, there's nothing so certain in the human condition as uncertainty. When we listen to the information as something that's energizing us, instead of frightening us and depleting us, it helps us be more innovative and creative. There's a fantastic study that was done in 2013 out of a group at Harvard. So these were people who were struggling with social anxiety disorder. And they had them do something that was really a sort of a torture session for someone with social anxiety, which is something called the Trier social stress test. You have to get up in front of a very judgmental panel of people who are sort of frowning at you and kind of looking negative on purpose. And you have to prepare in just a few minutes public speech, and then you have to later do a difficult math problem. What this group did is they took half of these people who were socially anxious, and they taught them something about anxiety. They said, listen, we're going to give you all this information about why when you feel anxiety, when you feel the butterflies in your stomach and your heart racing, that's actually not a bad thing. That's your body preparing to do well. That's your body marshaling its resources to be brave and persistent. And then the other half of the socially anxious group, they just gave some information about anxiety broadly. They didn't teach them this new mindset about anxiety. So now these people experience the Trier social stress test. And during the TSST, the folks who learned that anxiety could be helpful, they did better during the experiment. And they also had lower blood pressure, and they also had a lower heart rate. So literally their body showed fewer signs of stress, fewer signs of the wear and tear that over time is one of the reasons that stress can be problematic. So this mindset, this shift, is the way that we can also start to use anxiety, even when we're nervous, to be truly helpful to us. How does anxiety help you? What it helps you see is that because you're in the future tense and you care about making the good things happen in the future, it helps you see possibilities. Anxiety is that feeling that there is the possibility of possibilities. It can make us more persistent. It can make us be more fluent, to think outside the box, to be innovative when we need to, because we see that there's a possibility for something good to happen. That's being in the future tense. We know that anxiety triggers the fight-flight response, right? That's why we kind of think of it almost like fear. But it does much more than that. And science is only starting to really emphasize these other aspects. So when we're anxious, we also are more reward focused. We actually have higher levels of dopamine in our brain when we're anxious. We typically associate dopamine as a reward neurotransmitter, or something that we feel when we're experiencing something pleasurable, or even something that has to do with addiction. Well, anxiety triggers dopamine. Why? Because dopamine helps us move towards positive outcomes. It doesn't just happen after something positive has happened. It actually prepares us to make sure that positive thing happens. It also triggers our social bonding hormone, oxytocin. So oxytocin is that hormone that increases when we're with someone we love, when a mother nurses their child. It's one of the ways that we biologically bond to each other. And when we're anxious, that hormone shoots up. Why? Because social connection, social bonding, is one of the best ways that we manage our anxiety and actually outsource our coping in a way. Because social buffering is a very real phenomenon. To be able to reach out to others who we feel connected to and who support us, it helps us dial down anxiety and also use it in more positive ways. So anxiety, when we see it as a way to navigate uncertainty, that kind of carries within it, with this beautiful sort of fractal symmetry, its own solutions. In the book, I also talk about a three-part framework for doing something with anxiety, for working with it, because I spend the rest of the book really talking about this mindset. So now, what do we do? And there are three big parts to that framework. One is that we remember that anxiety is information, and we need to listen to it. Two is that sometimes it's not useful information. We can learn to tell the difference. And when we do know that it's not useful anxiety, we can use those great tools out there to let go and immerse ourselves in the present moment, get help through therapy, do those things that help us scale back from the future tense. And the third guideline is to really hitch that anxiety, that information we're getting about what we want in the future, what we care about, hitch it to purpose, hitch it to something that really matters to you, that gives your life a sense of meaning. Purpose doesn't have to be some overwhelming mission in life. It doesn't have to be, running a company and crushing it at all times. That's a great purpose. But purpose can even be something tiny, like wanting to increase my family's social connection in the world. Maybe I've decided, I feel a little isolated after the pandemic. I want my partner, my kids, I want to get out there and find a community. That can be purpose. When I think about leaders and managers, I think about, there's so much awareness now that's been great among leaders in business that, it's okay not to be okay, right? And that's one lesson we all learned during the pandemic. And I think a lot of companies have really come to the table to understand how to support their employees. And so one big step, I think a lot of companies are already taking, which is that we need more open and destigmatizing conversations about mental health and to give people support they need. I think that mental health is health. And the more that companies can shift their culture into understanding that, the better. We're sort of ignoring the emotional labor that we now expect of our leaders and our managers. So when you're a manager, you're a leader in your business, and now you know that you want to and need to have more open conversations about anxiety among your employees, about mental health. But now that labor is sort of falling on you. So now you have to is it your job to monitor your employees? Is it your job to be a therapist almost? Is our job really to remove all the obstacles that our employees face to really, whenever we see them be anxious, do we need to fix it right away? That is, I believe, unfair emotional labor to only put on leaders without there being real institutional support for that. Because leaders need to realize that it can't all be on them. That's not what their job was meant to be in many levels. And it's also not really what a company does. I mean, the company has to take care of its employees, but it also has a bottom line. So managers and leaders are sort of right in between where they're trying to navigate these two often conflictual goals. And so I think that just having conversations about the emotional labor that's happening in the workplace, how we can take some of that burden away from the individual leaders and make it more institutional to have approaches in place that are formalized, that is an important step. Another thing I think about when I think about anxiety and mental health in the workplace is this idea of safe spaces. So we have this idea that there has to be emotional safety for people to really share what they're experiencing when it comes to mental health. But the problem is that a lot of leaders feel really nervous about those safe spaces, that if they say the wrong thing or they take one wrong step, they'll do more damage than help, or they'll be canceled. I like to really go back to the origin of safe spaces, which looked nothing like safe spaces today. So Kurt Lewin, who's one of the fathers of social psychology, created the first safe spaces after World War II. And the goal of them was to improve and raise awareness about racial and religious bigotry and solve those problems so that there was less of those kinds of prejudices in the workplace and everyone could thrive and do better. But these safe spaces, these Lewin-esque safe spaces, were anything but emotionally safe. They were raw, they were honest. People were taught to communicate openly about their own personal biases with the assurance that there would be confidentiality and that they would not be condemned or judged. All the research that really came out of that movement showed that it was those difficult conversations that really allowed powerful change to happen in the workplace and beyond, and at the individual level. So when I think about anxiety and really navigating anxiety in the workplace, I think about those difficult conversations, that we shouldn't protect our employees from anxiety, from every uncomfortable emotion, but rather we help them work through it, that these dangerous emotions that we think of as dangerous are actually powerful, transformative, and crucial if we want to make things better internally with our own mental health as well as at the level of the workplace.